Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scarr Illustration, and I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk about a recent painting I created for the Folio Book Illustration Award 2025. Let's dive in. So this painting was a little bit different from what I usually do, in that most of the time I'm either painting for a specific client, or I'm painting something for my folio, or just for fun. Saying that, the actual painting process is pretty similar. The first thing that I did was to make myself familiar with the approved text. I also read through the competition details a few times to make sure I understood all the technical requirements. Then I spent some time looking at what other artists had created for the story over the years. After that, I looked at my folio work, thought about what I wanted to achieve with this painting, and from there I decided on a few concepts. And then I moved on to some thumbnail ideas. As I started on the thumbnails, I decided that I wanted to try and do something a little bit different from all the other illustrations that I'd seen from the past, to put my stamp on the fairy tale, as it were. So with that in mind, I came up with these initial ideas. And from there, I moved ahead and developed these ideas. After looking at the final thumbnails, I couldn't quite decide which one to go with. Usually it's pretty obvious which one is going to work the best by this stage, but not this time around. So I decided to create color sketches for all three of the thumbnails. And here they are. After a bit of back and forth, I eventually ended up liking the second idea the most, and developed that one a bit further. I went back and reread the approved text a few more times to see if there was anything else I could add to support the narrative of the piece. And then from there, I started to gather all the reference that I thought I might need, such as furniture from the time, house interiors, typical dress, hairstyles, rugs, picture frames, mirrors, and last but not least, witches. After that, I created an inspiration board as a visual guide for how I wanted the painting to look and feel. Once I'd gathered all of that, it was time to take my own reference photos for the figures. My wife kindly agreed to be the model for the witch, and of course, I was the model for the husband reflected in the mirror. In order to get the lighting as correct as I could, I decided to create a somewhat crude 3D model of the scene. Not only did this give me the lighting information that I needed, but it also gave me the correct perspective for things like the fireplace, the armchair, and the mirror. Once I had all of the reference materials that I needed, it was time to go through it all, distill it down, and create the final sketch. I usually take my time with this, as I've found that speeding through it will usually result in having to spend more time later on to fix the inevitable mistakes that weren't addressed in the sketch. And this one was no exception. I went to great lengths to ensure that everything was as good as I could make it, so that when I started in on the painting, I could enjoy the process, knowing that the bulk of the hard work had already been done. The first thing I did was to tint the canvas to a medium gray color. I find it much easier to start off with a colored background, rather than just plain old white. It's also easier to get the color relationships more accurate from the get-go. Next, I blocked in all the characters, the main elements, and put them all on separate layers. I found the easiest and quickest way to do that is to bust out the pen tool, create a path, and then simply fill that with a flat color. Once all the elements were blocked in, I then went back to the witch, added another layer on top, made a quick mask, and started to block in all the different areas of the figure. Once that was done, I flattened both of those layers, created another layer on top of that, made another quick mask, and started in on the final render. I tend to work on the hardest parts first, which in this case was the witch's face, as I found that's the best way for me to work. And in this case, it's also the main focal point, so it really needed to set the tone for the painting. And of course, I make sure that I have all the relevant reference on hand so I can refer back to it as needed. Next, I moved on to the witch's hands. These needed to be expressive, technically correct, and resemble what I imagined witches' hands to look like. Once the lights and shadows were on there, I moved on to the witch's dress. The outfit had a lot of drapery, and so I wanted to make sure that I mapped out all the intricate shadow areas so that all the folds made sense. I also added more texture than I would typically render, as I wanted the dress to feel coarse and rough, rather than soft. As I was painting her outfit, I noticed that her face seemed a bit too large, and so I reduced it in size, and it was back onto her outfit, where I spent time rendering all the folds and making sure the shadow areas suggested volume. I also added a strip of light to her back for the bounce light from the fire. After that, I moved on to the baby. Again, there were a lot of folds to get right. The baby also needed to look upset, so I spent time making sure that the facial expression really suggested that. Then I moved on to the foreground elements, starting with the mother's hand, and then onto the fabric that she's holding. With the hand, I wanted to make sure that it expressed the stress that she must have been feeling right at that moment. Once that was blocked in, it was time to tackle the father's reflection in the mirror. Again, the expression was everything with this character, as well as getting the lighting to look believable, with the cool light coming from a window off camera on the right side of his face to the firelight that was coming from below. Then I moved on to the background. I wanted the walls to feel old and in disrepair, and so I used some texture brushes to achieve that. I also used the lasso tool to make sure all the edges were nice and sharp, but not too sharp, as I find that tends to look a little too digital for my tastes. And again, I'm constantly referring to the reference that I'd gathered for this, to ensure that I got the look and feel that I was after. And because of that, this area of the painting ended up taking a fair amount of time to get right. Once the walls were basically done, I moved on to the armchair. This also proved to be somewhat challenging, although admittedly I haven't painted that many armchairs before. After I'd roughed in the light and shadow areas of the chair, I started working on the chair's pattern. I ended up painting that a few times before I arrived at something that I was happy with. Then it was time to work on the mirror. I roughed that in, and then moved on to the wooden cradle in the foreground. I painted in the basic tones, and then switched over to the fireplace. I knew that painting this would be challenging, as there's lots of different panes of light to get right. Plus, I also wanted the wood texture of the mantle to look convincing. Again, I used the lasso tool a fair amount, so as to get all the angles correct, as well as referring to my sketch. After that, I painted in the floorboards, with the reflected light from the fire, before moving on to the candle on top of the mantle. I took my time rendering the candle, as they are deceptively difficult to paint convincingly. And then I worked on the picture frame above the fireplace. I made sure to use the airbrush sparingly, so that I could emulate the texture of the frame. And finally, I started rendering the rug and the fireplace tools. Now that everything was basically rendered, it was time to go back and start finessing everything as a whole, by adjusting all the shadows and lights so that everything fit together as convincingly as possible, as well as double-checking all the values. At the top of my mind, I was making sure to balance the saturated colors from the fireplace with the cooler desaturated shadow areas, as well as fixing all the details to their relative position to the focal point. For this piece, I wanted to describe a part of the story that I hadn't seen depicted before. I also wanted to convey an underlying feeling of foreboding and anguish. and I think I managed to achieve that. I haven't done a ton of interior illustrations, and so I knew going in that there would be a number of challenges. But by gathering the right reference materials, I managed to minimize the amount of things that I had to make up, which also lowered my stress levels and allowed me to create the best work that I could at that time. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, hit that like button and subscribe for more tips on improving your art and staying creative. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep on painting.